I thought that it was normal to grow up with a preacher who didn't carry an English Bible because that's all I knew. So what's normal for one person may be completely out of left field for another group of people, and especially when you take a person, raised at one congregation trying to lead in a different setting. And that goes beyond just what your preacher was like. I mean, there's all the different size dynamics of large churches and small churches, and all the theological nuances. There's just a lot of stuff to sort out there.
Hey everyone, welcome to Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. Today I got to talk with Mark Adams, preaching minister for the King's Crossing Church of Christ in Corpus Christi, Texas, a lifelong friend of mine and peer mentor. Mark and I grew up at the same church back in Nashville, Tennessee. He was my first camp counselor. I worked with him as a youth intern for 2 summers, and now we're co-workers here down in Corpus Christi. I asked Mark what's one piece of advice he'd give young ministers, and in the course of our conversation, he shared several great ideas, not just for ministers, but anyone wanting to grow in discipleship. We talked about the necessity to invest in others and in yourself, and the grave dangers of overwork, something that seems like it's a bit of a virtue, but really has serious detrimental effects on ourselves and our relationships. I hope you'll be challenged and encouraged by our conversation. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we're having on the podcast, would you be willing to like and subscribe to us, and maybe share us with someone you think might benefit from this? And as always, thank y'all so much for tuning in today. Mark, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. We are in studio. This is a real treat to be able to record with you here in person in what we're affectionately now referring to as the studio, which is usually called my office. But anyway, I'm glad you're able to join us today. Before we get into our topic, I do want to ask, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How'd you get involved in ministry? How long have you been in ministry? Basically, give us the 10 peso version of what got us into all this.
Yeah, it's a weirder question to answer than it used to be because it has, I've been in ministry for a while now. Mm-hmm. But, I guess we should say for the sake of those listening, you and I have known each other for at least your entire life. I'm 5 years older than you. We both grew up at the Donaldson Church of Christ in Nashville, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And as far as my path into ministry, so I went into Harding. I guess we came from a church where the ministers were so professionalized. Yeah. We had a bunch of
and
professors
in the best possible sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Really, really talented people. Mm-hmm. And, I'm a kid coming out of high school. I don't know anything. Right. So I was looking at church involvement, and truthfully, throughout my life, I kind of thought about, it would be neat to be able to serve in a church. In fact, I have now at my house, my great-grandfather, when I was 2 years old, built me a podium. Because from the time I was a little bit, I have my own pulpit, and it's there it's at my house now. Yeah. But I always wanted to be a song leader, and Jim Biffle had been our song leader, and he always had the way he did his hands, and I would stand there and do my hand, and I couldn't begin to tell you when I started to feel some sort of call on my life towards church involvement in ministry. Mm-hmm. But I went into Harding, and what I was intending to do, they had a thing where you could add a few extra Bible hours and do a second major in vocational ministry. Right. Mm-hmm. And I said, okay, I don't have any idea what I'm going to major in, but I am going to do a second major in vocational ministry because I would like to be an asset to whatever church I attend one day when I'm graduated from here. And so I also had grown to where I really disliked it when people would start talking about the Bible, and it was what does this verse mean? I don't know. What does that translation say? Or what does that translation say? And I didn't like being dependent on other people to interpret Scripture for me. Yeah. I knew I wanted some better tools. And so I actually started off freshman year at Harding taking Greek, and because I really wanted to learn it. Yeah. And so there's a lot of things that's been helpful to me over the years.
I wonder how much of an influence, too, that guys like Bob Hendren had.
Yeah.
I was a little young when he wrapped up his tenure at Donaldson, but you would have remembered him a little bit better.
I was about 9 or 10 years old.
For folks who don't know, what was it about Bob's preaching that might lead you to be interested in New Testament Greek?
So I grew up with a preacher who never carried an English Bible. And in fact, at Donaldson, Bob taught Greek classes. So there's a number of members still active at Donaldson who in the late 70s, early 80s learned Greek from Bob Hendren.
Yeah.
And, these are not people who have professional seminary training. They're just church members who studied Greek, learned Greek. So I guess that was just part of our church culture, that we really valued scholarship. And so, for me, that was actually a pretty normal thing to pursue. And I guess I need to cut ahead, though, to your actual question of, like, how do I get into ministry from there? Yeah. So I wanted to be an asset to churches. I didn't have any idea what I wanted to major in. And it got to be the case that it was like, I just couldn't find anything that interested me other than the Bible courses and the ministry courses and the theology courses. And so I didn't think there was any chance I would have a career in ministry. In fact, I ended up doing a minor in computer science. For a while, I was doing a second major in IT and kind of landed, fortunately cut that back some and just turned it into a computer science minor. But so I was learning the languages stuff, and I got far enough along that it was like, I might as well just finish this out and make it a full degree because I've done the hours. And then I had to do a youth ministry internship in Sarasota, Florida. Okay. And I thought, as a teenager, I didn't really relate to my peers that well. And I don't think I'm going to be good at youth ministry. And went down there, and it's like the church just affirmed me so many different ways. Yeah. They're very encouraging. They would speak highly of, like, whatever lesson attempt I would make. I didn't have any idea what I was doing, but they were so affirming of me and encouraging. And along the way, also some experiences, like on a mission trip. There was, like, some guy that I really looked up to who was a few years older than me, and he paid me some very specific compliments on things related to, like, ministry and potential leadership. And anyway, just over time, I guess it's like the church affirmed me in enough ways that I started to see that, hey, I didn't completely fail at this. And, maybe there's some place for me. Yeah. And as I graduated from Harding, I was actively applying, like, I needed to stay in Searcy because now my wife, Carolina was doing a master's degree there in business. Yeah. And so I needed to stay in Searcy. So I was applying at Walmart, McDonald's. I was just trying to get a job. And I was talking to a guy named Heath in one of my computer science classes as I was getting close to graduating. And I said, do you know anybody who's hiring? He said, you mean churches? I'm like, church would be like a pipe dream. I just need a job. Yeah. And but he told me about his church, the Rosebud Church of Christ. And there's a whole nother story with how that all kind of worked itself out. But yeah, basically, it's like God just kind of dropped that in my lap. It ended up being a great fit. I preached for them for 3.5 years before we took a job at Old Hickory in Nashville, where you and I got to work together. Yeah. As it turns out, not for the last time.
Not for the last time.
Yeah. Right. So yeah, that was kind of my path. I think a lot of what led me that direction was I did have something in my heart that wanted it, but it was really the church, different members of the church saying affirming things and pointing out what they saw as strengths that over time I got my confidence up a little bit more.
Yeah. I love this idea that you wanted additional training, not because you knew that you were going to be a minister, but because you wanted to be an asset to whatever church you would land at. Right. Man, that's a really good thing that I think a lot of Christian colleges could really kind of focus on for folks. Like, hey, we know you don't all need to be Bible majors. That's fine. Right. But like, if you are planning at all to stay in any kind of church setting, having some knowledge of Scripture and how it works and how to understand it and how to apply it and like congregational dynamics and things like that, that's super useful.
I think a lot of people don't realize this, but if you go to one of our private Christian universities and even take some basic Bible courses, you and I grew up in kind of the buckle of the Bible Belt in Nashville, Tennessee, but for people in church settings not like Nashville or not close to one of our universities, if you're a person who went to one of the Christian colleges and studied under a couple of good professors, you're functionally one of the experts at the congregation. Yeah. Yeah. So,
it's not a stretch to say that. Like you've gotten more training Especially if you've had good professors, you've gotten more, like in terms of quantity and quality, better training than a lot of folks have.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so when did you first start at Rosebud? What year was that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Putting the dates on it. This is the weird part. I started. Now I had done internship and some other stuff prior to this, but I started preaching there in January of 2004.
Okay.
So, I'm terrible at math, Kevin. You're a Bible major.
Not 20 years.
You only deal with numbers like 12,
7.
40, 666. I don't deal with this stuff. But I'm whatever I am, 16, 17 years into this.
Man,
that's mind blowing. Is it doesn't feel like it.
Right. It's interesting to think that I have a nephew who's 16 years old. So like right around the time that he was being born, like you were just getting your start out at Rosebud.
Right.
All right. So you're at Rosebud for a little while, then Old Hickory Church of Christ, which is on the north side of Nashville, for those who aren't familiar. And then you've been here at the King's Crossing Church of Christ in Corpus Christi, Texas, for about 6-ish years.
6 years and some change. Yeah, September of 2014 is when I got started here.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So it's fair to say that you're not like a veteran minister of like 20, 30 years,
right.
Or pretty close to 20 actually. So like 30 or 40 years, like some of these guys that you and I know and have studied under. But you're definitely not young in the sense of inexperienced and brand new at this. You're not a rookie.
No. Yeah.
You are like 39, 40?
I'm 40.
Oh, man.
Thanks,
Kev. Sorry.
Yeah.
Mark is H. of the Young Ministers Network,
right.
a tract of lectures that I help direct and coordinate at Harding University's lectureship. I just wanted Mark to know that we're going to miss you. I don't know that we ever got you.
I was pretty much aged out by the time you started it.
Right,
so,
it was like 2 years ago. Last year we weren't able to do lectureship there.
Right.
But maybe we can make an exception. Like everybody gets like a red shirt year for like 2020.
Okay.
We'll see what they say about that. But you've been doing ministry for a while now.
Right.
Coming up on 2 decades.
Yeah.
And so what's been fun about being able to do this podcast with friends and colleagues is that I've been able to ask some guys who are veterans in ministry, what's one piece of advice you'd be able to give young ministers? I've been able to also ask some other younger guys, what's something you've learned in your 5, 7, 10 years of ministry? I could really pitch a version of that question to you, because I think you've kind of got a foot in both camps there.
Right.
So to get down to it with what we're going to do today, what's one thing that you would say that has really benefited your work in ministry wherever you've been?
Yeah. So I'll point to this as something I've been learning as I go, and something that's I think I've gotten better at over time. But I guess the way that I would introduce this, I was thinking about a conversation that we had a few weeks ago, and at this point we're coworkers. We both work together here at King's Crossing, and I was here in the studio, and I remember I mentioned to you that one of the elders had, I don't know if it was a text or a quick phone call. He said, "Hey, Mark, are you in today?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Hey, there's something I need to talk to you about. Can I drop by and us have a visit?"
Yeah, it was super vague, super ambiguous.
Yeah.
Like that was all he said.
Yeah, and I remember I just kind of casually mentioned to you, "Oh, yeah, so-and-so's coming to talk to me in my office." And you kind of hesitated and looked at me and said, does that make you anxious? I was like, "No." He said, "Well, do you know why he's coming to talk to you?" I said, "No." That doesn't concern you a little bit? Like you were kind of feeling anxiety on my behalf, but I wasn't having any anxiety.
Right, yeah.
And so it was a pleasant conversation. But what I'm thinking about, and I also think like the position that I'm in at this stage in my life, and I hate to talk about ministry as a career, but I don't know what other word to use. But like at this stage in my life of ministry, I think it is useful to have people giving you advice who are sometimes way, way further down the road than you. But a lot of times it's also nice to hear from someone who's just maybe a couple of steps ahead of you.
Yeah.
And I think I can still speak to kind of like the new ministers in this regard.
Yeah.
Because I'm not much past this phase. But I think a real common struggle for ministers, and especially our relationship to elders, is the power dynamics there that are kind of unavoidable, right? Like, as much as I would love to say that I am purely just friends with the elders, and I have a really good relationship with our elders here, there's very few times where that little thought doesn't at least go off in my head that this guy, is kind of an authority figure for me, has a lot of influence over my family's well-being. It's impossible for those power dynamics not to somewhat be in play anytime you're talking.
The worst possible example of that is these guys could fire me today.
Exactly.
If you don't have some kind of contract, right? So
right.
I know some churches do that, but the worst possible manifestation of that power dynamic is like, if they said, okay, it's been real, but you got to go.
Right.
It's like that can happen.
It does happen. Yeah. And so I think what I'd like to share is what has helped me get to a point where I don't live with that kind of anxiety. Like, I do think it's possible to get to a place where your relationship with your elders, your fellow ministry staff, and hopefully quite a few members of the congregation, like, I think it's possible to get to the point that you don't have to constantly worry about that. And so to kind of get into how this works, let's be honest, especially those of us who are younger in ministry, we all have a need for growth.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? So sometimes people pay me compliments where it's like they want to pay you a compliment, but they also know it sounds a little insulting to say, man, you've gotten so much better than you were 5 years ago.
It feels like a backhanded compliment.
Well, but it kind of is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is the implication that you're better now than you were then.
Yeah.
And back then I did have some room for improvement as well.
Yeah. My wife gives me that compliment a lot. I'm teasing.
Yes. But I think that's a fair thing, though. And I also would say my goal is that 5 years from now, someone could say the very same thing, looking at the work I'm doing now. Mark, you've continued getting better at understanding the congregation, at how you communicate your message from the Word, the way that you care for people. I would love it to be the case that sanctification is a real thing.
Wow.
Like, I'm continually being
right?
Like, I'm continually being formed by the Spirit of Christ alive in me, and that I am growing in my love, I am growing in my dedication, and that I am a better, mirror of the image of Christ. Yeah. So I think growth is something that we desire, but I think one of the hardest conversations for anyone is, how do you talk to someone about the fact that they need to grow, right?
Because the implication is you see some deficiency
right.
in what they're doing.
Right.
And it's not to say that they're necessarily doing something bad or wrong. It's just that, there is room for improvement here some ways.
This something about what you're doing is not going as well as it could be going.
Right. Yeah.
And truthfully, all of us have blind spots. Mm-hmm. I mean, we just do, because of, mentioning our upbringing. I mean, I thought that it was normal to grow up with a preacher who didn't carry an English Bible.
Right.
Because that's all I knew.
Yeah.
So, what's normal for one person may be completely out of left field for another group of people. And especially when you take a person, raised at one congregation trying to lead in a different setting. And that goes beyond just what your preacher was like. I mean, there's all the different size dynamics of large churches and small churches, and all the theological nuances. There's just a lot of stuff to sort out there. And so one thing that I guess it's kind of a long introduction into what I want to talk about, but one thing, I'd like to share a practice that has helped me make substantial progress in creating spaces where I'm able to be open and honest with the people that I'm working with, and it doesn't create conflict and doesn't create additional tension much of the time. Yeah. And so what I started doing a few years ago, looking at myself, I was working on a process called a rule of life, which is like a spiritual formation term where you're trying to set specific strategies for, what am I going to do this year, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually? What is my plan for how I'm going to try to let God work on me and help me grow over this year? Try to do that every year. But one of the things someone challenged me on, I'd put together my strategy, and I thought, this is good. And I showed it to this guy who was a classmate at the time, and I said, hey, look this over for me, see what you think about it. And I'm thinking, nice work, Mark. And what he said is, hey, this is fine. There's not a single thing you have on this list that involves other human beings.
fascinating.
Yeah, so like I'm a hardcore introvert, and so that's all the stuff I wanted to do was just more time in solitude and reading things and praying by myself. And like, you need to do something for your spiritual growth that involves another human being.
That is fascinating.
And so,
are you willing to say who that was, or do you remember?
I don't remember the guy's name. Okay. It was just some random person I had a class with when I was working on my master's degree.
Random guy. Props to you.
Yeah, I think his name was Robert, but I can't remember his last name.
Okay,
but. Anyway, it was a good observation. So somehow, I don't remember the point at which this completely shifted, but I've learned that meal times are just good times to connect with people in general. I think most of the productivity that happens in my ministry happens usually meeting with someone over lunch or for breakfast or coffee or something. Just it's a good space to talk. Mm-hmm. And so I started this discipline where every year I will try to select. When I've had more time, I've actually chosen 2 individuals. I would try to pick one who could be kind of a mentor figure to me, and a second who is more of a peer or maybe someone I was kind of helping along. But I would get these 2 people. I would talk to them around October, November, and say, hey, for the next year, I would like for you and me to pick a day of the month, based on your schedule. I'm a minister. I'm a little more flexible. So let's say 3rd Thursday of every month, I'm putting it on my calendar, setting reminders. You and me are going to go to lunch somewhere. And when we go to lunch, maybe we talk shop a little bit, but really the point of this is to help each other grow spiritually. Mm-hmm. So I want us to be open with each other. I want us to pray with each other and for each other. And let's just have a year of really trying to be spiritual companions. Like let's make it spiritual, not just talk about small talk, the weather, sports, whatever. Like let's really make sure we continue to go there. I've never had anyone who didn't take that as a wonderful compliment that I invited them to do something like that.
That's great.
And so in general, that's wonderful for your relationship with anybody you're doing that with. Mm-hmm. If you've spent a year actively getting with another person for an hour and a half at a time to share your lives, pray for each other, like good bonding happens there. But another shift I made once I started doing this was I thought, whoever it is that I'm connecting with, one of those 2 people for me, and for a while it's gotten to where I really just have had time to meet with one regularly, but I said, I'm going to let that person be an elder. Mm-hmm. And frankly, if you're starting with this discipline, maybe it's dangerous to say this out loud, but I would recommend start with the elder that you have the hardest time relating to.
Okay. Why is that?
Because, it's kind of a foundational thing of good leadership is that whenever you feel an inclination to put up a wall with someone, it means you need to get to know them better. Right. So it's kind of a discipline to practice. But I have to tell you, like at our congregation here at King's Crossing, most of the elders who hired me, you have your tryout Sunday. I hate that terminology, but not many times in my life have I just like really hit it out of the park. But it was like I could tell it went pretty well.
Yeah.
And all the other elders were just saying, oh, man, yeah, you're the guy. Whatever it's going to take to get you here, yeah, we can't wait to get you started. And then this one who was like, it wasn't bad, but, man, this is going to be a hard decision. I wish we could hire you and the other guy who's also in the running, but I don't guess that'll work. But, man, this is going to be a tough decision.
That same elder tried to do the same thing with me, but I already knew there was nobody else in the running.
Yeah.
It was too late because I already knew.
Right. And maybe that's a wise thing on his part to help me from getting my ego too inflated. But,
sure.
But at the time, anyway, there were a couple of other things where I just kind of wasn't getting him. And so that was...
And I think that's probably the best way. It wasn't like you had serious negative experiences.
No negative experiences.
It was like you're running on different wavelengths, or like you weren't getting maybe each other's sense of humor or whatever it was.
Yeah. But I mean, you really do, with a lot of people, you kind of have to get to know them before you understand how to take what they say and what they mean and what their intentions are. And so I would recommend, if you're getting this practice started, if there's one elder you've really struggled with, like start with that guy. And I'll tell you, if you've met with someone and shared in their life and prayed with them and for them and celebrated victories with them and had them pick you up when you're going through a hard time, man, that's powerful. But, I have to say that elder now happens to be one of my closest friends who will be a friend for life.
Yeah.
This is someone I just dearly, dearly love, him and his family, and in ways I can't describe.
Yeah.
But all that stemmed from me just approaching him in November that year and saying, hey, I need someone to be kind of a prayer partner, spiritual companion. Would you be willing to consider? And he was glad to. Mm-hmm. And that did a lot of good things. So in the practice of getting with someone like this is an important component of this. Even though I'll say, we're there to work on each other spiritually and encourage each other, specifically with elders, I try very hard to take the posture of saying, I do view you as a shepherd of my soul. Mm-hmm. And I bring up the blind spot thing. I just know there are some ways here that I'm probably not doing things as well as I could be doing them. There are probably things you wish you could say to me, but it's hard to know how to bring it up without, worrying about confrontation, or how do I bring this up to Mark because he may get upset.
Yeah.
I am actively requesting that you tell me that stuff.
Yeah.
And by keeping that door wide open, I couldn't tell you. My tenure here at King's Crossing, I'll just not be humble right now. I think we've had a really good experience together. I think I've been a good fit for this church. I think they've been a great fit for me.
Yeah.
I'm so pleased with a lot of the things that we really have done together. It's not me, it's us.
All right.
We've done it together. But so much of that has stemmed from I've got this real rock solid connection to the elders at all times where if there's going to be a blip on the radar, like he knew me well enough that he could just call me up and be, hey, we didn't see this coming, but let me get you in on this. Let me make sure you know what's going on.
Yeah.
They could bring things up to me. There've been some pretty big ideas that I was getting ready to pitch here where, dealing with a bunch of guys with a business background, and I'm a guy with a ministry background. And I would say, okay, here's kind of what I'm wanting. Here's what my goals are. Here's my motives. Here's what I was thinking of doing. And he would say, okay, I get where you're coming from, but talking to guys like this, you should say it like this, this, and this.
Interesting.
And so a lot of the things I've wanted to push through, and I watch some of our ministry friends on Facebook groups that we're in who really get frustrated and struggle with feeling so detached from the leaders. But I'm like, by keeping those doors just super open, it's like we're always working on this stuff together. And by proactively anticipating obstacles or right ways or wrong ways to say things and do things, I think I've had a lot less frustration in how we've gone about things. So I'll say beyond that, that was a phenomenally healthy practice for me and one elder, but it's also an agreement that once we get to December, this was great. We're still always you're always welcome to do lunch with me anytime.
Right.
And we often still will, but I am going to move on and have a new partner for next year.
Yeah.
And so I've been here long enough that now we have 2 new elders we just got in the last year, and pandemic and the birth of my first child has made just about everything impossible. But all the other elders, I have spent an entire year doing lunch with and praying with once a month, somewhere along the way. Mm-hmm. And it is the case that any one of these guys feels like they can call me up anytime and say, hey, can I come by and chat with you? And I know them well enough. We're close enough to where I'm like, if it was a real problem, I mean, it would be okay for them to bring it up.
Yeah.
But also, I would have probably known about it already.
Yeah. And so, when they say, hey, can I swing by real quick? Or do you mind if I call you real quick? That's not anxiety inducing for you like it could be for a lot of folks.
Right. Yeah. Not even a little bit. Yeah. Not even a little bit. I'm at the point now where I think of the elders as some of my closest friends. And I also think what a benefit it has been to our congregation. I can't speak for the people here, but I do think that what happens at the leadership level has a big trickle down to the rest of the congregation. And some of this is like the Bowen systems theory, but you look to leaders, and if there's anxiety in a congregation, if the leader looks rattled, what you assume is, well, I know a little bit. That guy really knows a lot more than I know. Yeah. And if he's panicking, I ought to be just losing it, right? So I think that by very actively seeking out peace and unity, I hate to use terms like high levels, but I mean among leaders of a congregation, by us having a really peaceful, prayer-based, spiritually supportive relationship with each other, that has done a lot of good, I believe, for our congregation. We're operating as a unit. It is not the case that I regularly show up at meetings worried about the dynamics of how to try and work around this guy or battle this guy. It's don't have any of that. Yeah. Very, very rarely.
Something that I think is related to that is relevant not just for elders, but really with church members, kind of at large, is that when you've spent time with somebody like this, regularly getting to know them, regularly investing in them, allowing each of you into each other's lives to be able to see exactly what's going on. Maybe not, all the deepest, darkest secrets and things like that,
Sure.
but at least having a pretty high degree of vulnerability and openness with each other. I think you pave the way for building the kind of relationship to where when somebody in that mix does blow up at you, or they do come across as uncharacteristically gruff or something like that, you probably know them well enough to know that whatever problem appears to have set them off is probably not the real root of the problem.
Yeah.
We've talked about this recently just in our own personal conversations. Have you seen that play out in your time in churches where you've got somebody, they're upset about something, come to find out that there's actually more going on. It's the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Is that something that you can talk generally about?
Yeah,
right?
I won't share any specific examples.
There's a collective sigh of relief.
Right. Yes. But okay, so I'll say this, and I think it's a true statement. And again, I'm talking on 17 years of full-time ministry. 100% of the time, and I've been chewed out several times, 100% of the times that I have been chewed out over something, I mean, just absolutely got my head bitten off, didn't see it coming.
Yeah.
The issue I was chewed out about was never actually the issue.
Fascinating.
Not a single time.
Yeah.
When I either took the time to know more about them or dug a little deeper, it has always been the case that, sure, I did something and unintentionally, it got taken the wrong way or offended them somehow, and they really went after me, but come to find out, well, it has more to do with some kind of problem circumstance at home, with a spouse, with children, or something that's just really negative that's weighing on them. And, people just carry this tension with them,
right.
And sometimes you're the lucky vent.
Well, and as the minister too, especially in our fellowship, where typically the preaching minister he's not given the title of pastor. Right. He's not given the all the privileges of pastor, but
right.
definitely given the responsibilities and duties of pastor.
Yeah.
You're the front man.
Right.
Right or wrong, you're the front man, and it's easy for people to associate negative feelings with church.
Yeah.
With you,
right,
and how it's just so strange that happens. But I mean, like you said, like you mentioned earlier, you and I have a number of friends in various Facebook circles, and it really does seem like that is often the case.
Yeah.
That the problem is not the problem,
right, and a similar method to what I've been describing. My friend Jared Robinson preaches up in Abilene. Very wise person. I respect Jared a lot. And he talked about one time, shared kind of an experience where someone was really upset about, I don't know if it was a doctrinal issue or whatever the issue was, but he was sharing advice his father gave him, which was get together with this person for lunch, encourage them to bring in writing exactly the things they're concerned about, the verses that they want you to consider, get them to put it in writing so that you can really, you really do need to give it a look. Yeah. But as soon as you get together, take the packet, say, thanks so much for this. I'm going to definitely look it over, and then immediately make a pastoral shift and say, man, just catch me up on you. How are things going? How's your family? Tell me about your background. Like the questions you're asking me at the beginning. Tell me what's been a blessing to you in your faith. Tell me what led you to where you are. But make a real pastoral shift, and a lot of times the issue kind of resolves itself. Mm-hmm. But it makes a difference, Kevin, to some of the stuff you were just sharing, how inevitably we're going to have disagreements, and especially in a transitional season like we're in, where none of us really knows what's coming up next, right? Pandemic has thrown everything into turmoil.
We're nearing post-pandemic.
Yeah, we're nearing it.
We're nearing post-pandemic. We're not there. Texas has reopened to a significant degree that a lot of other states haven't, and so things are moving a little bit differently down here than elsewhere. But we are nearing a point where it's kind of like, well, okay, now what did we used to do? Yeah, it's like where are we? Like we haven't had this kind of freedom in a year or so.
Right. So what I'm thinking about is how inevitably we're going to have disagreements, especially when we're in a season where, like it or not, things are going to have to change. Yeah. Like they're just going to have to, and we're going to have to adapt. And it is so different to have a disagreement with someone whose backstory I already know, whose buttons I already know, who I've invested in. Not just talking about elders, but really all the church members. By really investing in our relationships, to your point, spending time with each other, it needs to be the case that when we disagree, that the thought of me and you kind of separating from each other sounds painful. Like we have enough of a connection to where pulling apart over this issue or whatever it is would feel like a genuine loss to me and to you.
Yeah.
And that's a better way to have to disagree with someone. Like there needs to be something at stake, because if we just show up, worship together, shake hands, and really we're just people occupying the same space for an hour or two a week, but there's not any depth beyond that, you have a nasty disagreement. It's really, other than me wanting to win, there's not that, I don't feel any sense of loss by you taking a hike. And that's not what I think church is supposed to be.
I definitely don't see anywhere in the earliest depictions of the first Christians them being okay with just occupying the same space as the people there with them.
Right.
There was definitely something more. I mean, you get to Acts chapter 6 and this whole discussion about how these people that we're occupying this space with have suddenly realized that they're not being taken care of adequately. It was distribution of food, so it wasn't like, hey, this isn't meeting our preferences. Like, we're not being able to eat because of this. There had to be some kind of really relationship built up.
Yeah.
I suspect if a deeper relationship had existed between these folks who were missing out and some of the other folks who were not missing out, had a deeper relationship existed between those two groups, probably wouldn't have had that oversight.
Right.
Probably wouldn't have had that oversight. Let me ask this. All right, so this is kind of a bonus question, but I know you and I have talked about at least these kinds of things before. How do you think social media has infected our ability to disagree? And I choose the word infected.
Right.
That might be a loaded question the way it's phrased, but I think you and I have pretty similar thoughts on this.
Right.
What about social media? Does that make it easier to disagree with people here at church? What do you think? Especially if you don't have a relationship with them.
Right. I mean, that's been my big problem with social media, is just arguing with strangers. You know, we were all figuring it out, in kind of the mid 2000s. And I know, goodness, I probably need to do a deep dive like to around 2007, 2008 and make sure I don't have anything left on there I'd be embarrassed about. There's like the great, snowball fight of 2006 where you would kind of repost things like that on each other's wall. But
back at that point in time, I think Facebook was still just for college students.
Yeah. When we got on it, you had to have a college email address. And no offense to the boomers, but it all went downhill once that opened up. But,
I don't know if I can cut that out in post. So I think we're stuck with it.
It's okay. Yeah, that's, like I say, no offense, but I think that
bless their hearts.
Bless their hearts. No, and it's not just that, but
no, because like all the millennials that are on there now are every bit as foolish as any other group.
Well, I was talking with one of our friends named Peyton, who was saying he feels like sometimes with social media, the older generation doesn't understand really what it is or how it works, and therefore uses it badly. And like millennials, Gen Z are a little different. Like they grasp what they're doing, but are choosing to use it harmfully.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So both groups are using it badly.
Yeah.
One is maybe due out of some degree of ignorance or maybe unfamiliarity.
Their moms and dads didn't teach them how to use social media when they were growing up. Right? I mean, it wasn't a thing. So
now, when you get a radio ad,
here's
what you do.
But so man, that's a hard question to answer. There are some ways that social media, I mean, even like being able to share conversations like this, there are some ways that we can get good ideas, healthy things out to lots of people very easily. What a blessing. I don't want to lose that capability.
Right. Yeah.
But I have decided that at least on hot button topics, I remain willing to talk to anyone about anything. I really will. And at the same time, I have decided that I basically won't do it on social media.
Yeah.
I have been part of very, very few conversations about anything related to politics or even church problems.
Church practice.
Yeah, church practice is it seems to very, very rarely be something that is uplifting and life-giving. It ends up being some kind of a bashing on this group or bashing on that group. And I've decided that for a lot of the really important stuff, I want to do it face-to-face.
Yeah.
Because in general, I think I can talk to most people about even, hot topics. And if we're sitting at a table looking across from each other, it's real different than lobbing insults at strangers over social media.
Yeah. It's interesting how that physical disconnection from people often turns a lot of us into kind of stone cold, I don't want to say killers.
Yeah, well, I mean, is it any different really than road rage? I don't know who that idiot is in that car, but
right.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not in any kind of relationship with that person other than the fact that they're driving in a way that angers me.
Right.
This person behaving on social media like a fool. They're doing essentially the same thing.
Right.
It's so because of the physical disconnection with a lot of these folks, we've almost lost a touch.
Yeah.
Of humanizing.
Yeah.
These kinds of folks. And that's, again, another reason why it's important to do more than just occupy space with people in the church that you attend, which brings me again back to that example from Acts chapter 6.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you at our congregation, we got people who feel strongly on both sides of the political aisle that we worship with every Sunday.
Even down here in Texas?
Yeah, even down here in Texas, yeah. And we are a better church because both of them are present. Like they're authentic Christian people, and I'm glad they're here.
Goodness, yeah. All right, so not naming names, right?
Not at all.
But we can think of folks that will be the first to volunteer, or the first to cut a check, or the first to step up and say, we can do X, Y, and Z, or whatever it is, who are very strongly politically affiliated one way or the other.
Right.
And it's that in itself, like you're right, like that is something that has greatly benefited our church. It's almost in spite of those extra Christian affiliations. You've got these folks that are deeply dedicated to really to serving.
Right.
Yeah, to serving.
Right.
Another question that I wanted to ask, and this is all kind of related to what's one piece of advice you'd give for young ministers. Maybe a handful, maybe 2 or 3 big influences on you for ministry. Professors, former ministers, stuff like that. Basically allowing you to give a shout out to some folks that chances are I would probably know them as well, and so it's just fun for me to get to hype these people up.
Oh man, it's like you almost hate to list any at the exclusion of any others.
Right.
I have to say, probably the reason I was able to go into ministry was Bruce McClarty.
Okay.
Bruce McClarty and his wife Ann. When I was at Harding, he was still the preacher at the College Church of Christ. This is before he had gotten involved at Harding, on staff or faculty, whatever the right term would be there. But they would do a Wednesday night Bible study for junior and senior Bible majors and their significant others, and it was all the stuff you didn't get in the classes. Right, like he was talking about real practical matters and how to deal with this and what this is like. Sometimes we would split up, and Ann would just talk to the girls, and Bruce would talk to the guys. But cool. I know that for my wife, that was kind of the thing she needed because she didn't grow up.
She didn't grow up in church.
Yeah, not particularly in church.
Sort of nominally related to
nominally religious, but certainly not a member of Churches of Christ.
Yeah.
So this is a whole culture to try and figure out. And
not to mention a totally different
country as well,
national culture too. Yeah.
And she's done great with it and has embraced it. But I know that I would have to thank Bruce and Ann for just significant ways that they helped us out. I would have to say also, I mean, like Randy Harris being our preacher growing up.
Yeah.
Randy's been a huge influence in a lot of people's lives. Gary Holloway, who was the first professor I had for spiritual formation, Gary has been a really good source of wisdom for me as well.
Yeah.
He's the guy who first introduced me in a more extended way to like contemplative spirituality, which I credit with, I don't want to say saving my soul, but like at a time that I was really kind of drying up on the vine and had no idea what to do.
Yeah.
He's the guy who kind of guided me into some new kinds of practices that could help me rethink how I approach reading scripture, how I approach praying, and found there was like a place for me that kind of worked for me.
What was like spiritual direction? What'd you call it?
Yeah, well, I would say like spiritual formation, contemplative spirituality. I think for me it was kind of the way that we typically prayed, like in Sunday school growing up, or even at school. I was going to a private Christian school. Like prayer ended up being God's to-do list. So what do we need to pray about? Well, we got to fix this. God, do it. And
I've never heard it put quite that way, but I
you know what I mean.
I've prayed so many of those prayers myself.
Right. Yeah. And I was at a point early in my ministry at Rosebud. So this is a weird thing. At no point did I ever really feel distant from God, but I went for a period of years where I basically never prayed personally. Like I would pray when I was with people, for people, but in terms of like me praying on my own, since that was pretty much my going model and I had become unsatisfied with it, I kind of didn't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that relates to anybody listening to us from Donaldson might remember Dan Midgett, but the biggest faith crisis of my life was when I was, around a junior in high school, and Dan had a brain tumor, and I was reading those verses about how, praying in faith and believe and don't doubt and you'll receive. And so I was really like at home as a teenager praying daily, fervently that he would be healed of this brain tumor, thinking the trick is you can't allow yourself to doubt. So I was absolutely believing that God was going to do it. And then he died of a brain tumor.
At 55.
Yeah. Yeah, he was young.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that I've had other hard losses since then, plenty of them, something about that one, because I had prayed so much, I wasn't going to I didn't want to turn my back on God, but I was kind of looking at prayer and saying, oh, okay, whatever prayer is, it's apparently not this. And however it works to pray to God about your life, apparently this isn't how that functions.
Did you ever think that it didn't work?
Yeah.
That thought crossed your mind?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's like, basically it just sent me into a tailspin of confusion. I didn't know how to pray anymore because the one thing I was confident of when I was like in my late teens, early 20s is like, I know that I'm not that bright. So I don't know what's best for my life. Like, I don't know what I need. And if all I know how to do in prayer is to ask God to give me stuff, then I'm like, why don't I just pray and say, God, you know what I need better than I do. So you just give it to me. But it was also my way of kind of avoiding like petitionary prayer, even though I think Jesus teaches us to do that. Petitionary prayer, I think it's a scriptural thing to do. I continue. I will, as long as I live, I will have a hard time praying in that way.
Yeah. For our audience, can you briefly explain petitionary prayer?
Yeah, petitionary prayer is just simply when you're praying and asking God to do something. God, we got this concern, and
it's like generally the way that people pray.
And the way that we pray in most church contexts. Again, here's God's to-do list. Here's all the stuff I wish God would do.
Yeah.
And I got really uncomfortable with that. And so once I took Gary's class at Lipscomb in spiritual formation, and I started learning about ways of thinking about prayer beyond just asking God for things, making movements in prayer from kind of an Eastern tradition where, rather than using all the words I can come up with to describe God, he's Father, Savior, Master, Lord, you can kind of like proliferate words, but the Eastern tradition has a tendency to do what they would call apophatic movement, which is where you're kind of letting go of. So you would say, I could call God my Father, but he's so much more than my Father, and the word doesn't even do him justice.
Right.
And so one by one, kind of letting go of whatever I would try to say about God somehow leads me to a place of deeper awe of his majesty, because I have no words to say, yet I'm completely amazed by his presence.
Yeah.
And those kinds of movements, it gave me, not that I think that should be an exclusive way that you do personal reflection.
Yeah, not to the exclusion of other
And I'm not down on petitionary prayer. It's made a huge difference in my life. I encourage people to practice it. I just have a hard time with it. But Gary gave me some different tools. And also, I mentioned earlier the practice of a rule of life. That's another Gary Holloway thing. And I know it's not just a Gary thing. It's a big thing. But he's the one who taught me how to do it. And so, if I were listing people who've been really impactful, I would have to say Bruce McClarty and Gary Holloway are two that permanently impacted my Christian walk and ministry.
Yeah, to the point where you ended up writing a dissertation, right, on spiritual formation?
So, the reason I did the Doctor of Ministry at Lipscomb was because I was mostly interested in spiritual formation. So the direction that I went with my dissertation, Lipscomb has a dual emphasis. Frankly, it was really more of a triple emphasis because you had spiritual formation, missional leadership, missional theology, and then there's a huge preaching homiletics component. That's not the one that's formally billed, but you got to do a ton of stuff with it. But the spiritual formation stuff is what got me in that program because I just wanted to know more. I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to understand it better. And then I ended up doing my dissertation more along the missional theology route. I had decided from the beginning I needed to have something I really cared about. I wanted to contribute to the greater body of research on, and short-term missions were that thing for me. It was on a short-term mission trip that I mentioned I had someone really kind of affirm me and led me into ministry. So I wanted to do some research related to short-term missions. I had intended to do something with spiritual formation, ended up going more the direction of kind of the missional church movement and asking questions about like how can our churches involve in a short-term mission trip, help them to be formed more missionally. So that was kind of where I ended up going. But the spiritual formation has remained a huge part of my practices. And I had the benefit also, after I did my DMin, the Cybert Institute at Abilene Christian University, Randy Harris and Carson Reed, they've got kind of a special program for what they would call like senior ministers, preaching ministers in the first half of their career, where it was additional spiritual formation stuff. So beyond getting the doctorate, I got to spend 2 years, going twice a year with another group of ministers where Randy, who's a real, kind of a guru on this stuff, he's really good on this stuff, and getting to work with a program that he was kind of custom building. And so all that has helped me, and I'm glad to be able to practice it and occasionally share it.
And related to that, you have a practice where you intentionally kind of disconnect and withdraw for about a week or so from the, not from the life of the congregation, but from the day-to-day grind of the congregation, to where you can really focus on prayer and reflection and reading and things like that. But you've got one of those coming up, right?
Next week. Next week.
At the time of recording, next week.
The day after Easter. I'm heading over to spend some time doing that stuff.
And he's not going to tell you where, so you can't find him.
Right. Yeah, but no, I'll say, so here's a piece of advice for anyone listening in. If you would like to get a new minister without having to fire and hire someone, let them refresh themselves.
Wow. Yeah.
And so this
it's like if you're working at a church and you're thinking, man, we would love for we've got this guy here. He started off so well. What's the deal? You're saying, give him a week. Like a week, right? Not a month. He doesn't need a semester-long sabbatical.
Not that I'm opposed to that, but
all expenses paid. But like, just try a week, and encourage them to actually take this.
Yeah, and I would say, for anyone who wants to try something like this, it's helpful to go in with a plan. Like, don't make the whole thing just reading books, even though I love doing that. But so I fortunately was able to work this out with the elders. It's a good conversation to have when you're starting a new position. But that was part of my agreement with the elders here, that every year, ideally in the fall, this last fall, the plans all got messed up. So I'm kind of making it up now, and I'll do another one this
potential
fall.
COVID scares,
COVID scare,
and everything else.
I was supposed to be off that week, and I ended up being the only minister on staff who was present that Sunday. Everybody else was in quarantine.
Who was able to come because all of us were potentially exposed. Thankfully, none of us were, but still.
But basically I'll have a week a year where I don't have any kind of preaching, teaching, visiting. Like, I have no expectations placed on me whatsoever, other than I'm going to pull back, and I really do dedicate a significant amount of time to prayer. Sometimes I do some book study, but I really do a lot more kind of meditative readings of Scripture. So instead of me like whipping out all my Greek and Hebrew tools, it's like I often will even find a single passage of Scripture. We get so greedy when we read the Bible, where it's all about like, how can I make sure I read the whole thing through and consume more and more, or finish the book? I found it's really healthy to go the opposite direction and say, you know what, no matter how much I'd rather read 3 books of the Bible, today I get 1 chapter, and I'm going to read that thing over and over and over and over. And in fact, the sermon series I just preached a few weeks ago, I did these 3 Psalms back to back. That was what came out of my last attempted sabbatical in the fall. I've gravitated to these 3. those are the only 3 passages of Scripture that I read the whole week. I read each of them at least dozens of times. And I'm talking along with periods of intense, asking God to show me what he wants me to see in this text, trying to listen not just with my mind, but also with my heart, looking for how it could form me. And it's a great way to allow God to be working on you. But setting aside a time. One of the things I'm trying to do with this too, Kevin, is like, I think it's unfortunate that people would look at me and say, well, you're a minister, so you perhaps need that time to recharge. I'm like, I don't think ministers are the only people who are Christians who need to have intentional times of pulling back and really working on their time with God. Like, could you take half a day off of work, find a really quiet place, and just you and your Bible and pray and like intentionally take some time off? Leave all the tech behind and just you and God and see what happens.
Or maybe if taking off work is not going to work, something like couple days of a week, or like 2 or 3 nights. Turn off the TV. Set the phone in the other room. I mean, sure, emergencies happen. If you need to be reached, that's fine. But like, set that stuff down, and then just take that 2 or 3 hours that night, and then 2 or 3 hours the next night. And see what you can do with that.
I would say whatever you can do is better than not doing it.
It certainly would seem worth doing, right?
And you're right, with family circumstances, it's different for everybody.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think really intentionally carving out time, and when I go on this sabbatical, I invite the congregation. I've got a lot of them who I know really do pray for me during that week, asking God to guide me and kind of help me to know what our congregation needs. Basically, I spend the first half of this time deeply in contemplation and reflecting on Scripture. I move toward trying to put together some loose plans for what I might preach or teach the next year.
So, what is to kind of bring this home a little bit? The very first thing you mentioned, this first practice of recognizing your need for growth, and then therefore, getting a regular kind of lunch get together with with one elder once a month for a year. That is very clearly an example of investing in the people around you. This week sabbatical, and I say sabbatical because it's not a semester long or whatever, but like this week-long period of time and reflection, that is very clearly investing in yourself. So you've got investing in others, investing in yourself. And I think one of the reasons why I can imagine that some ministers might even be anxious about doing that is because we have consistently, I think it's a cultural value, which is very clearly permeated into church cultures as well, this danger of overwork.
Oh, that's the truth, man.
Like people love to say he was dedicated. As a minister, I'd drive past and I'd see his office light on at night.
It's an idol. Like that. So I mean, in a culture that
overdoes
it's
dangerous.
It is dangerous. It's not healthy. But when we treat overcommittedness as a virtue, like when you want to say you're doing well, how you doing, Kevin? Oh, I'm keeping busy.
Staying busy.
Staying
on top of it.
And so that was for me anxiety-inducing, especially my first 2 years here, because I started in September. My first sabbatical week was in like October, November. So I had not even been here a quarter when I did it for the first time. And I had several people make the same joke. And I know it was a joke, but it also was a little revealing, which was, so you're going to go spend a week like praying? And the joke was, it must be nice to get paid not to do anything. And I'm like, okay, I'm choosing not to read too much into that. But the ability to say that. What does that say about the way we value prayer?
I guess we forgot about those times when Jesus would spend all night in prayer. Must be nice not to do anything all night, Jesus.
Right.
Okay, let's see you say that.
Right. No, and I think that I'm just kind of curious. I don't know if many people have even attempted to pray. If you've never tried to pray an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours at a time, man, it's hard. I mean, it's nourishing and helpful, but man, doing the work of prayer, this is hard work. I mean, I think Paul's the one who's telling Timothy, who some of the older widows, like part of the work they do for the church is that they're the ones constantly lifting everyone up in prayer because it's a big job. So, yeah, I think that it was anxiety inducing. But I know that at this point, I know the church here, like most of the members know that I do this and are supportive of it. But I also think what I hope would happen is that some of them also would choose to view that as an example they should follow.
Yeah.
I really am trying to lead by example in this regard. And so, even things like Tuesdays are my days off. I try as hard as I can not to work on Tuesdays.
Yep.
And I'm like, I think that people need an example of me trying to refuse to participate in this culture of over busyness, overworking, overdoing it. And so by me pulling back that week of the year, I mean, again, the first couple of years, it was very anxiety inducing because it's like, they're going to think I'm a lazy minister.
Right.
But I had to choose that, like, I made an effort to choose, this is the kind of person I'm trying to be. Mm-hmm. Their perceptions will have to catch up, but I know I want to be the kind of person who pulls back and prays. That's how I'm choosing to structure my life and my devotional life. And I hope that people will be respectful of that.
I think I understood you correctly there when you said their perception of me is going to catch up. You're giving them the benefit of the doubt that eventually they'll see what's going on.
Yeah.
And ideally, the benefits will become apparent. I'm reminded too of the current preacher at our home congregation, Russ King.
Oh man, yeah.
He, I remember being there.
I could list him as an example too. Probably should have.
Exactly. I remember being there. Just happened to be there one Sunday when he was there. I think relatively early in his tenure there. And he had said something about the fact of like why he was preaching 3 out of 4 Sundays a month or something along those lines. He was like, look, this is not a sprint. I'm intending for this to be a marathon.
Right.
And so, like I am going to take off one Sunday a month. At least at that point in time, he was doing that. I don't know if that's still currently what he's doing, but I heard him say that, and I thought, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense. He's expecting to be here for the long haul, so. Why wouldn't he not beat himself up in the beginning?
Right.
And he's avoiding this, and like Russ had put in his time too. I mean, goodness, he was planning on doing that. My understanding is, I think he was planning on being there at least until retirement age or until he would retire. There was no reason for him to feel like he needed to cave to overwork because he wasn't a young minister who was trying to prove himself.
That's one of the benefits of getting a little older, Kevin, is like, when you're in your 20s.
Maybe someday I'll be 40.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, when you're in your 20s and it's like you feel the need to prove yourself and I've got to work harder and do more. And not that you don't still want to work hard, but it's also like, not everything has to get done today. And you can still be effective and impactful even if you don't get absolutely everything done that you envision.
Yeah. I've tried to start making my daily to-do lists shorter.
Yeah.
Because I know it's not that I'm going to do less things, but a few things will come up.
Yeah.
And it'll be necessary for me to handle those things.
Right.
And then instead of beating myself up about how I didn't get, I only got 4 of my 7 things done. I could create a list of 4 and get 3 of those things done,
right?
Knowing that I still did other things, knowing that I still had important conversations with the people who are regularly in and out of our office here at church.
Right. Something I've appreciated here, Kevin, is that, and I told the elders, like I do think I burned myself out a good bit at Old Hickory. I really did. And I've told my elders here coming into it, like my tendency is to raise my hand too often and do too much. And I do think it's true that in ministry, you generally have either workaholics or lazy people hiding out. Like we're usually one or the other. Most often, I think we tend towards being workaholics. Yeah. And so I'd ask them from the beginning to kind of protect me from my tendency to do that. And fortunately, I say to their credit, they've really worked at that. Mm-hmm. So when I say, hey, we need to do such and such, I'm thinking about, and they're like, that could probably wait. Or don't you have this other thing? Or do you really have time for this? Or is that really yours to worry about?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah. I think that especially in the time that we're talking, kind of getting close to the end of the pandemic, John Dobbs wrote a really good article that got a lot of traction back several months ago.
The coming pastoral crash, right?
Yeah.
And for those who don't know, John Dobbs is a minister somewhere out west.
I think
is that right?
Oh, it's embarrassing.
He's on Facebook.
I want to say it's the Forsyth. I don't know how to. I have to look it up. He's a great minister. He has a blog called, I think, Out Here Hope Remains.
Yeah,
but
we'll get the production assistant on that.
That's right. Yeah. He will. But you could Google it and probably find this. It got
the coming pastoral crash.
Yeah, coming pastoral crash or coming ministerial crash.
Yeah, something along those lines.
But man, I pulled that one back up a few weeks ago, and he's so right. Like you and I were talking about this. How
when was that originally published?
It was pretty early in the pandemic.
I want to say like summer of last year. Quarantine measures hit around March. Yeah. And so March, April, May, June, like somewhere around there. Like you're pretty fresh into this.
Right.
Last year.
So he was very insightful. A sort of prophetic type word. I mean, he really was speaking into what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I know you and I have talked about this. How as we've been discussing today, I'm one who has been very active in trying to create routines in my life that lead to personal health and also congregational health. We have a wonderful support system in that we got elders that love us and support us. We have good relationships with them. Obviously, we enjoy being coworkers, and the others we got on staff are all phenomenal. Like I love coming to work every day. Even with all that in place, I don't know about you, but I feel exhausted. Yeah. This last year of suddenly everything we've been taught about how to do ministry, you can't do any of it because you can't be around people.
Can't be around people.
And then all of a sudden, I mean, I go from my son being born one week to running a TV production studio from my,
from your office,
from my office at home the next week.
The other studio.
Right, the other studio, which fortunately I had been dabbling in podcasting. There's my podcast commercial. But
Kingdom Upgrowth.
Check it out.
Find it on Facebook, YouTube, and kingdomupgrowth.com. Mark's got some good stuff. He needs to get back on it. But he just had a kid, guys, last year, so give him a little bit of break.
Right, yeah, we've been not slacking off. It's just been busy.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, I think that even with all the good things we have in place, it's been really hard on everyone.
Ministers had to become TV producers overnight. I've mentioned that, I think, at least one other time on the podcast before, and I said that a couple times last year. It's like suddenly, like I had some prior experience in working with iMovie, which is the native video editing app for Apple products. But my prior experience of that had come from years earlier when I was editing Ultimate Frisbee highlight videos in Luke Dockery's apartment, the guy that I went to college with. So it's like, it's a little bit different putting together a church worship service than it is an Ultimate Frisbee highlight video.
Sure. Well, and I mean, even things like, well, how do you do communion? Like for us, that's a big thing.
Oh, yeah.
What is that supposed to look like? And how do you work in prayers? And how do I try to include people? And so many of our people who'd be willing to do things like lead prayers are super non-techie.
Right.
So, like this ended up being, it goes beyond just trying to do video production. It's like, it's not just ministers. I know it's everybody who's really been in a tough season, but I don't think it's ever been more important that churches, like your minister is probably not going to have the courage to approach talking about that power dynamic. It's pretty hard to go to elders and say, man, I really just need, I need a breather.
Yeah.
I need something to recharge. It's hard to ask for that, especially if it's not built into your expectations.
Right. And because because we have a lot of churches haven't been meeting. Some still haven't met in person, but a lot of churches haven't been meeting consistently or they weren't meeting consistently for 6+ months, and then only recently distance meetings and things like that. The perception is, well, you haven't been doing anything.
Right. Oh man. Yeah, and just being candid, I've gotten a few snide comments along the way too. I wish I could say everybody's 100% supportive. Most have been really appreciative and all, but yeah, people are all struggling. And we were talking about angry people earlier. Like sometimes people just say things because they need a place to vent. But
and a lot of times,
I've never been in a worse position to try and receive venting than I have been this last year. Like it's harder for us to endure what we normally could just roll with.
Yeah, and like we were saying earlier, almost always, but for you 100%, the problem that leads somebody to blow up at you is not the real problem. Mm-hmm. Everybody has been exasperated in one way or another with the difficulties of not being able to be connected in ways that we really took for granted.
Right.
Mark, as we draw near to our time together today, is there anything else you're thinking about and want to mention? Anything that you want to wrap us up with before we close today?
Oh man, I guess just to highlight what I've been talking about, time spent intentionally trying to move yourself closer to God, or I should say, putting yourself in a position that God can move you closer to Him. Right? Yeah. I do think that spiritual growth is a work of the Spirit and the work of God in you. So, trying to make spaces where God can do that, and also making yourself receptive and open to genuine connections with the people you serve. That is not time wasted.
Yeah. All right, Mark. Really appreciate it, man.
It's been a blast. This is the first time I've gotten to do an in-person podcast. I do some of this stuff too, but normally I'm staring at a camera lens, trying to simulate like we're looking at each other. It's nice to actually have somebody to look at.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, agreed. So, man, we appreciate it. We'll definitely have you on again sometime.
Sure, anytime.
Especially because I could literally walk to your house, or I could toss a paper wad from my office to your office.
Yeah. So, hey, turn the stereo down.
Yeah. Actually, your stereo system in your office is pretty sweet. So
probably better than it ought to be.
I've got a couple of brothers who would find it pretty rad because you've got an actual record player in there. Yeah. It'd be pretty sweet.
Right.
So, Mark, take care, man. We'll see you next time.
See ya.